Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 9, Industry, Labor Unions, and Immigrants, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom. You should know the phrase, the new immigrants. The old immigrants are those who were here first. And for a means of contrast, the old immigrants tend to be English-speaking. They tend to be from Great Britain. They speak English because they're from England, or perhaps they're from Ireland or Wales or Scotland. The old immigrants also come from the northern part of the continent, places like Germany and the Netherlands and Scandinavia. They tend to be mostly Protestant, and they tend to be to end up on the farms more than not, and they tend to, compared to the new immigrants, are going to have more education. And when the new immigrants come after the Civil War, in the tail end of the 1800s, they're not coming from northern and western Protestant Europe, but they tend to be disproportionately Catholic and Jewish, and to a lesser extent Orthodox. They tend to be less likely to speak English, less familiarity with democracy, less educated, and more likely to get stuck in the cities. And they're going to be accused of causing the slums and places with crime and prostitution and the things that are associated with big cities and slums. And this is going to cause a resurgence of nativism. Remember the nativism before the Civil War. Kind of a context might be you've got the Germans and the Irish, and you've got the Know-Nothing Party before the Civil War, but now after the Civil War you've got these Hungarians and Poles and Italians and Slovenes and Russian Jews and people from the Baltic states. And this is going to bring the the Immigration Restriction League into existence. And a literacy test is passed by Congress. It is vetoed by President Cleveland. So there is and we're not going to get the door slammed on immigrants until after World War I. But this is, you see a rise in hostility towards these newcomers, that somehow they're not assimilating, they're not fitting in. And the only group that's ever specifically legislated against from coming to America are the Chinese in 1882 and the Chinese Exclusion Act. Keep in mind that in California, about 10% of the population is Chinese, and they're kept from voting, they're kept from buying land, and there's riots against them, and there's violence against the Chinese. This is followed later by the Gentlemen's Agreement. This is going to be a little bit later. This is actually under President Roosevelt after the turn of the century. And this is going to be called the Gentlemen's Agreement. Remember the idea of a gentleman's handshake. It's not a legislative act where there's going to be discrimination against the Japanese in California, in particular their kids in schools. And Roosevelt's going to sort of cut this deal that the kids won't be discriminated against in schools in California. At least the government, U.S. government, will put a word in for the Japanese kids, and in turn, the Japanese will just simply stop sending us immigrants. And this is one of these things that's going to, lead to some humiliation and kind of a sting here going into the 20th century between us and the Japanese. City machines and bosses. Think of machines and bosses in quotes here. A machine is a city government which is supported by these immigrants. If you wonder, how do they figure out what to do when they get here? Because there is no welfare state system like we have today. Well, the machines would, somebody would meet you off the boat, and they'd help you find a place to stay, they'd help you get a job, they'd help your kids adjust to school. And the machine is run by a boss. And basically, you have a system of trading votes for favors. The house burns down or a tenement catches on fire, and the machine will be there, passing out clothing and finding people a place to stay. So you get this accusation that by other Americans that the cities are being run by these corrupt governments, backed by these corrupt immigrants. At least that's the perception by many. And Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, this is from his book, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. He's going to be saying that earlier, you have, around the time of the American Revolution, you have history as being seen as the struggle between monarchy and democracy across the Atlantic. And then by the time we get to the Civil War, history is seen as a conflict between freemen in the North and a slavocracy in the South. And by the end of the century, there's a different spin. that American history is defined as movement to the West onto the frontier, and the frontier is the great democratizer. The frontier is the great assimilator, the great equalizer. That as immigrants bump into the frontier, this strips from them their foreignness. You have to survive. Everyone's equal on the frontier, and this is what makes foreigners, Europeans, Americans. And his thesis has a kind of a pessimistic side to it. The frontier is defined by the census, a certain number of people per square mile, and the frontier ends in 1890. This is right around the time the country is going to be flooded and with, up to a million a year of these new immigrants. And Turner is suggesting that without the frontier as the agent of Americanization and assimilation, that these foreigners will not become Americans. Democracy is in danger. Plessy versus Ferguson, you may remember this from after the Civil War unit there. 1896, the Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is constitutional. It upholds Jim Crow and segregation up until the 1954 Brown versus the School Board of Topeka, Kansas decision, which will end this, but that's not for another 58 years. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. These are two black leaders. Booker is the older one, and W.E.B. Du Bois is several decades later. And Washington grows up as a slave. He's got a book called Up from Slavery. And his analysis and his prescription here for the freedmen is not to agitate, not to ask for equality. The former slave owners, these are, your racist neighbors, aren't going to be treating you that way. That's too much to ask. But he does call for the African American freedmen to work hard, to get skills, to rather than if all you're doing is chopping and hoeing and planting and harvesting cotton, to learn how to do something else. Become a mechanic, become perhaps a pharmacist or a teacher. He's got these black colleges. Get a more skilled job, become a carpenter, become a welder, become a mason, something which we would say a craftsman, a tradesman, something where you're making more money. And this is something that white Southerners can't fault you with, that you're working hard and you're putting food on the plate of your family. And he says, he's got this famous speech in Atlanta, the Atlanta Compromise. He calls blacks to throw down their bucket where they're at, to pull up water from the well, to raise themselves up by their own bootstraps. And by doing so, they're like fingers on a hand. The hand is the hand of the South, which is trying to improve, but you can be separate, but you can be working for the same goal: prosperity, economic growth, and that whites don't have to fear blacks. Blacks simply want to better themselves, and by doing this are going to be working towards a common goal. So he is not, he's not a supporter by segregation of any means, but he's a realist, perhaps we might want to say. And his college, we might say a Votech type school, is the Tuskegee Institute. Whereas W.E.B. Du Bois, he's from up north. He's this, his biography is kind of interesting. He's, as far as I know, he's maybe the only black kid in this little town in New England. And he is, really the town rallies around him. He's got a mom who's bedridden, and he is this sort of poor kid who has a lot of support. And he is going to be part of the NAGRA conference, which in 1905 founds the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and his book is called The Soul of Black Folks. And he's going to argue that what the black man needs in America is not simply to work harder and to make more money, but to demand his rights as an American citizenship, and that is citizenship and the right to vote. And he's calling upon what he calls the talented tenth, talented tenth. These are black leaders who should step out and protest segregation and discrimination and such. So you've got these two advocates, and Booker T. Washington later on is going to get a bad rap, I think, maybe an editorial comment for not fighting stronger against discrimination, but Washington is sort of saying what can be done at the moment, where W.E.B. Du Bois, as a Northern black, is with a lot more freedom to do something like organizing the NAACP in New York State, is going to argue, call on your fellow citizens to give you your full rights. Jane Addams is the founder of the Whole House. It's one of these settlement houses, and the settlement house movement is geared towards helping poor women, helping poor immigrant women become Americans, helping them assimilate, giving them English lessons, sort of maybe a place for women who are abused to land with their children, giving them lessons in perhaps how to cook, helping them run sort of interference for getting them through legal issues. And the settlement house movement is largely run by Protestant women who are later going to be part of this progressive movement that's going to be happening at the turn of the century, trying to win rights for the poor immigrants, in particular poor women. The Gibson Girls, the artist who does the Gibson Girls is portraying these women which are kind of a precursor of the women who are going to demand and get suffrage in the 19th Amendment. And these are women who are, for their time, they're doing men's things. They're playing cards with men. They're hiking. They're swimming. They're playing sports. Kind of cartoonish girls in magazines who are more and more a liberated woman. The social gospel is a term for, in the Protestant world, you have a call for bringing Christ's kingdom out of some sort of nebulous spiritual world to the earth. That Christians, when you pray that Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that you should be making this world just, that you should be standing up for the poor, for the exploited, for the immigrant. And one guy to know for our purposes here is Charles Sheldon. And in his steps, this is one of the, I think it's one of the top 10 books really in American history for the number of books that are published. And in it, the question is, what would you do if you were living the life of Jesus? And this is sort of very similar to that movement a number of years ago where people wore those armbands, the wristbands. And it'll come to me in a minute what they say, but in his steps, it's a call to live a Christ life like life in this world. The Salvation Army is formed in England, and the Salvation Army, today, it's a religious denomination, but it's better known for its charitable works. It runs places for the homeless. It runs food kitchens, and it's a help for those who are poor and the down and out. In the Catholic world, the Pope issues an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, and Rerum Novarum says that Catholics are not don't advocate capitalism, and they don't advocate communism. They're not. It's not to be, on the side of a class war against the wealthy, and the purpose is not just to make a lot of money, that we're called to care for each other. And perhaps in a practical way, Rerum Novarum approves of labor unions. And this is a big deal when you've got a country full of millions of Catholic immigrants. So the social gospel movement is an attempt to make the Christian faith hands-on, applicable, relevant, meaningful in a world where there's slums and suffering and ghettos and exploitation, and it's an attempt to help the poor. Henry George is going to write a book called Progress in Poverty, in which he advocates a single tax, a land tax. And this book is going to sell hundreds of thousands of copies, and it's going to become really the genesis of this idea of the 16th Amendment, which is going to be an amendment that changes the Constitution to allow an income tax. And this really says something about the concern by many that the rich are basically getting away with a lot. They just have too much of the money. Edward Bellamy writes a book called Looking Backward. It's kind of Rip Van Winkle's story. This guy, he's trapped under the rubble and an earthquake, and 100 years later or so, he comes out of this, and the world has changed. It's a world without without poverty. It's a world without exploitation. Everybody owns through a corporate situation. The government owns all these warehouses, and you work as much as you want. You work different jobs. You get to switch around. You go to a government warehouse. You get your food. You get your clothing, and everybody's sort of looking for each other, looking at each other, watching each other's back. And there's just no poverty and suffering, and it's a vision of a socialist utopia. And it's it's kind of Edenic, it's kind of naive, but the social gospel, poverty and progress and poverty, looking backward, are all attempts to do something about the suffering, which is huge at this time. And when we get to the next unit, we're going to look at some very specific political actions that come out of the populist and the progressive movement. There is a reform movement that's going to really take root and have some success at the turn of the century. And that's what we're moving into in this unit. William Sumner and social Darwinism, he's a proponent of the idea that Darwinism, or natural selection as applied to society, explains what's going on, why the rich are rich and the poor are poor. And social Darwinists are going to say that the rich, the well-off, the successful, deserve to be well off, that somehow they are superior in their morality, their intelligence, their work ethic, and those who are poor are morally flawed, that these people, like many in the slums, drink too much, they're promiscuous, they gamble, they're lazy, maybe they're inherently stupid. There's some of that eugenics, racism business going on, and the social Darwinists are going to be among those backing laissez-faire economics, that the government should just let society play out, that those who are successful and those who want to work hard, those immigrants who come over and hustle and have some get up and go, they're going to do well, and that's the sort of the story of American history. That's why people are coming over. Nobody needs to help the lazy, and nobody should block the hardworking. And one of the rags to riches stories of those who are immigrants is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie comes over when he's 12 years old. His dad is an unemployed weaver from Scotland. Carnegie starts out as a bobbin boy, and he's going to be a messenger boy for Western Union. He's going to be a telegraph operator, and he's going to be a secretary. He makes some money. He starts investing it. He starts making more money. And he's going to be this immigrant kid who becomes sort of this titan, this tycoon who controls basically most of the American steel industry through his use of the Bessemer process, which is a way to make steel more cheaply. And when he retires as an older man, he's going to be an advocate of philanthropy, that you should use your wealth to help others. But he wouldn't give a dime to a beggar, because you don't know what they're going to do with it, and you're just doing this to make yourself feel good. But he believed in giving money for things like schools and libraries and concert halls and museums and parks. He believed in spiritual uplift, but he believed that libraries is probably what he's most famous for, and he gave away $300+ million for helping people sort of climb up that ladder. Horatio Alger is an author. He's one of the best-selling authors last few decades of the 1800s, and all his stories, about 100 stories of boys who go from rags to riches, which is the title of one of his books. These kids, they start out, they work hard, they save their money, they get an education, they start going to church, they open up a bank account, they avoid troublemakers and gamblers, and they don't mess around going to vaudeville shows, and they're responsible for their families. And all these kids don't make it phenomenally rich like Andrew Carnegie, but they make it into the middle class. And these books are kind of syrupy, they're easy to read, they're sort of, I guess maybe we'd say a mid-high school level reading level. And these books explain America, that this is a place where anything's possible for anyone who will work hard. And again, it gives justification for those who succeed, and it is a warning, and it's a hope for those who are not succeeding to just stick it out and work harder. How does government aid business? Just some thoughts. Is the government really laissez-faire? Is the government really hands-off? Remember, Transcontinental Railroad and other railroads are getting subsidies by the government. They're getting land grants. The government under Hayes and under Cleveland, send in the army to bust up the railway strike of 1877 and the Pullman strike of 1894. The government has a high tariff. This is a political act which is keeping competition away from American factories. You could argue that open immigration, maybe it's a weak argument, but by allowing open immigration, you're allowing wages to be kept low by competition, and American unions want to sort of close the open door for immigration. You also have laws that are banning unions as violations of the sort of restraint of free trade. They're conspiracies to block free trade. Industrial problems and rise of unions. Problems in industry: low pay, long hours, dangerous working conditions, child laborers. And unions are organizations of workers who want to advance their interests, namely shorter hours, better pay, safer conditions. And there's 4 unions that you should be familiar with: the Knights of Labor, Take Anybody, and they are advocating for a non-adversarial relationship between management and the workers. In Germany, they're called workers' councils today, where today in Germany, and this is one thing which Elizabeth Warren, who at this taping is advocating for American businesses, that the workers should have a certain percentage, maybe 20-30% of the people running a business should have a say in who's hired and who's fired and what the company, should they relocate or make this, or, the whole policies of the business. And this gives you an idea. This is what the Knights of Labor was advocating: not socialism, not taking over the business, but that there should be a non-adversarial. There should be arbitration and education and cooperation in running the business, so the people at the bottom, the workers, would have more, but they would have a vested interest in seeing this business prosper. And this is only right, and it's good, and it's healthy, and it's beneficial for everyone in the long run. Knights of Labor begins to fall apart after the Haymarket riot, which is blamed on them. The Knights of Labor officially doesn't support strikes, and of course there is a strike in Chicago against the McCormick factory. A bomb is thrown, a lot of people die in this Haymarket riot, and the Knights of Labor and unions are basically tagged as being run by agitators and rabble-rousers and socialists and foreigners. The AFL is the American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers, and this is a union that's more narrow. It's hiring craftsmen, it's hiring whites, and it's not it's not organizing blacks and women along with men. This is a very particular, it's like an American union, according to the people at the time, and it's craftsmen, it's tradesmen, it's people with a skill, those mechanics, those electricians, whom a factory can't go without for running the production line. And Gompers is basically saying, we're going to strike, we want more money, we want more bread and butter. Sometimes this is called bread and butter unionism. It's a little counterintuitive, but this union that wants more money, this is something that management, that the owners can deal with. You want more money, you're going to keep working, you're going to make me prosperous, you're not going to shut the place down with a strike, done. Here's more money, let's work. And this is seen as it's not a threat. It's not like the Knights of Labor, who've got this kind of outrageous demand that they actually get a say in what's being done. The third union is the IWW. Again, it's open for everyone, and this is a socialist union. And they're advocating striking for more wages and voting socialist to end capitalism, owning the private ownership of what are called the means of production. Means of production refer to factories, refer to railroads, refer to banks, refer to mines. And the Knights of Labor, not successful. Wobblies, not successful. The Wobblies attacked by private goons like the Pinkertons, attacked by state militias, attacked by the U.S. military. The AFL today is it's hyphenated with the CIO, and the AFL is the biggest private corporation union still today. The Pullman strike is a strike against George Pullman, and he's the guy who makes these cars on trains that you have the little restaurant and the sleeping cars and the lounge in. And because he cuts pay during an economic downturn in 1893. The strike is in 1894, but he maintains the requirement that you have to live in his company town, and you're paying very high rent to him. You're paying very high utilities, which he doesn't cut, even though he's cut your pay. This leads to a strike in Chicago. And Eugene Debs, who is this, he's in charge of the American Railway Union. He's thrown in jail in the 1870s. He's thrown in jail again in the 1890s. And while he's sitting and contemplating, what's going wrong here, he becomes a socialist. He decides that the private ownership of the means of production, meaning capitalism, is wrong, is ineffective, and he comes out of jail a socialist. And you'll see him later. He's running, he gets almost 1 million votes in 1912, and he's thrown in jail for opposing World War I, saying it's basically a war by the rich using the poor as cannon fodder, and he's going to be thrown in jail for violating a Sedition Act. This is during World War I, where he criticizes the government. And he's going to get 400,000 votes as a socialist sitting in a federal penitentiary. Eventually, Warren G. Harding lets him out. But Eugene Debs is the leader of, he's one of the founders of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, the Socialist Union. And their nickname is the Wobblies. Some last thoughts here. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which has its intention to bust up monopolies, is passed in 1890, but it is not used against unions until we get to Teddy Roosevelt in the first years of the 1900s. But for the first 10 years, it's used against unions. It's sort of a perverse result against an anti-monopoly law, and it's used against unions. They are conspiracies. They're like monopolies of workers, conspiracies against free trade. And there's a case at the turn of the century. It's called U.S. versus E.C. Knight. E.C. Knight is a sugar manufacturer, controls 98% of the sugar production in the country. And somebody in the government here is using the Sherman Antitrust Act against them. Supreme Court rules for E.C. Knight. And E.C. Knight says, hey, the Sherman Antitrust Act is only valid if you use the Interstate Commerce Act, which says only Congress can restrict trade between states. But they say, hey, we're a manufacturer. We're not running the trains that are moving the sugar, and this is not applicable to us as a manufacturer. You can only use it against railroads that trade stuff. So this basically takes the teeth out of the Sherman Antitrust Act until Teddy Roosevelt is going to pull it out, blow the dust off, and use it against some of the rich guys like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller. We'll get to that when we get to the next unit on progressives. Some names just to know, some inventors. You've got Thomas Edison, you've got the light bulb, you've got the phonograph, you've got what's called the dynamo, not just the light bulb, but he's going to build the electric plants that are going to provide the electricity, and he's going to make a lot of his money that way. You got Elisha Otis, who invents the elevator brake, and this is kind of a big deal as buildings get higher. People don't want to go up more than a few floors, and there's fear, and there's justifiable fear, there's elevator accidents. But after Otis invents the elevator brake, which I had no clue how it works, people basically don't think at all about taking elevators anymore, and so he's allowing cities eventually to grow vertically with the steel framing that Carnegie's Bessemer. Carnegie's going to allow with his making steel plentiful and cheap. And the Bessemer process is invented by Henry Bessemer. It's a way of, steel has a much stronger tensile strength than iron. So steel is really the metal of what some call the Second Industrial Revolution at the end of the 1800s, in contrast to iron at the beginning of the 1800s. And James Eads, EADS, kind of an interesting guy, at least I think so. He's the guy who comes up with this device called the caisson, and it is a sort of, think of an overturned bin or tub that has an air pocket, and you drop it through the water down to the bottom of a river, and it allows you to dig underwater through the mud and the muck and the silt to get down to the bedrock to build things like the pilings, the piers for the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is an important invention to make bridges bigger and stronger. So just some things here from Unit 9 to know. Good luck. Signing out.